The training hall buzzed with the energy of nervous anticipation. Alien cadets stood in their ranks, eyes focused on their instructor, waiting for the next command. Each of them came from distant corners of the galaxy, trained to be the best in their respective fields. But today, none of that mattered. Today, they would face an impossible challenge. A challenge unlike any they had encountered before. The instructor, a tall figure with a sharp gaze, stood before them. His voice was calm but had a trace of excitement, which made the air in the room feel even heavier. "Cadets," he began, "today you face a simulation that has broken the spirits of many before you. This is a siege that has lasted a century. You will face overwhelming odds and be tested to your very limits." The alien cadets looked at each other. They had been trained for tough battles, but no one had ever experienced something like this, a siege that had gone on for 100 years. How could anyone be prepared for that? "The objective is simple," the instructor continued. "Stop the siege, but not in the way you think. You will have 1 hour to turn the tide, 1 hour to do what countless others failed to do. The enemy is relentless. They've beaten every attempt to take them down. It is a war of attrition. Only the strongest survive." A murmur rippled through the room. The aliens exchanged uncertain glances. They were no strangers to battles and wars, but no one in the galaxy had ever been able to break a siege like this. 100 years of war, of constant conflict, and still no one had succeeded in breaking it. How could they? How could anyone? Then the door to the training hall opened, and all eyes turned toward it. The human cadets stepped inside. The Deathworlders. Humanity had earned its place among the stars, but not because of their technology or diplomacy. No, it was their sheer will to survive that had made them legendary. They were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because they had the best weapons, but because they could endure the worst conditions imaginable. Their homeworld, Earth, was a planet of death. Their survival instincts had honed them into warriors capable of surviving the harshest environments in combat. The alien cadets couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The human cadets were different. They didn't carry themselves with arrogance like some of the other species. There was no need for arrogance. The Deathworlders didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They let their actions speak for themselves. The instructor smiled slightly, as if he could sense the tension in the room. "You'll be working alongside them today," he said. "They are here to help you learn. You will observe their tactics, their strategy, and see why they are the most feared warriors in the galaxy. The only thing you need to understand is this: the Deathworlders don't play by the same rules you do." The alien cadets stiffened, unsure of what to expect. Some of them had heard the stories. The Deathworlders had earned a reputation for doing the impossible, but the stories they heard were always exaggerated. They couldn't possibly be as formidable as the tales suggested, could they? As the simulation began, the holographic battlefield materialized in front of them. A vast city lay in ruins, with enemy forces entrenched in every corner. It was a fortress that had stood strong against every assault for over a century. No one had ever managed to break through its defenses, no matter how advanced or prepared they were. The aliens took their positions, beginning to lay out their strategy. They had studied siege warfare extensively. They had the tools, the knowledge, and the experience to face this. They were confident, ready for the challenge. But then, they looked over to the human cadets. The Deathworlders weren't planning. They weren't strategizing. They weren't even talking. Instead, they moved swiftly, with no hesitation, as if they had already seen the battlefield 100 times before. It was clear to the aliens now. The Deathworlders didn't need preparation. They didn't need to overthink. Their instincts guided them. And that made them terrifying. Before the alien cadets could even react, the Deathworlders made their first move. It wasn't a calculated strike, nor was it a complex maneuver. It was simple, brutal, and effective. The human cadets tore through the enemy's outer defenses in a matter of minutes, shattering barriers that had been built over centuries. The aliens couldn't believe their eyes. It was happening so fast. How could it be possible? 100 years of effort, gone in an instant. The human cadets didn't slow down. They didn't waste a second. They were everywhere at once, taking down enemy forces in the most unorthodox and unpredictable ways. The alien cadets had expected a slow, grinding battle. What they were witnessing was pure chaos, a force of nature. The instructor watched with a mixture of awe and satisfaction. This was the true power of the Dithworlders. Their ability to adapt, to act without hesitation, and to dominate with a sheer force of will was unparalleled. The alien cadets were frozen in disbelief. How could they win when their enemies were already making moves they had never even considered? What chance did they have against the Dithworlders? But it was too late for doubt. The challenge had been set, and there was no turning back. The Dithworlders' approach. The alien cadets were still in shock. They had watched as the human cadets tore through the enemy's defenses with what seemed like effortless precision. To the aliens, it was incomprehensible. The Dithworlders were not using the advanced technology that other species depended on. They weren't relying on grand strategies, intricate plans, or superior numbers. They weren't even following any recognizable tactics. They were simply doing. Impossible, muttered one of the alien cadets, a Zordian warrior, as he watched the human cadets move like ghosts through the battlefield, outflanking the enemy at every turn. How can they fight like this? Beside him, a Tarkian strategist tried to make sense of it. Their actions, they're unpredictable. They're not following the textbook rules of war. He shook his head in disbelief. How are they doing this? The instructor, who had been silently observing the chaos unfold, stepped forward. His voice, calm yet filled with authority, cut through the cadets' murmurs. "This is what makes the Dithworlders so dangerous," he said. "They don't fight like any of you. They fight with instinct, with sheer willpower. They don't need to analyze every move or wait for the perfect opportunity. They create the opportunities." The alien cadets were starting to feel uneasy. They had trained for years, studied strategies passed down for millennia, and followed the most complex battle plans. But none of that was working now. In this battle, the Dithworlders seemed to be operating on a different level entirely. While the alien cadets struggled to adjust, the human cadets continued their relentless assault, their movements coordinated without speaking. Every action they took seemed to disrupt the enemy's lines, breaking through their defenses with terrifying speed. "Follow them," the instructor commanded. "You'll learn more in the next few minutes than you have in years of training." The alien cadets, reluctant but curious, moved into position, trying to keep up with the Dithworlders. But every time they tried to replicate what they saw, it was like they were 2 steps behind. They couldn't match the human speed or adaptability. It was as if the Dithworlders had already seen the battlefield in their minds and knew exactly what to do before the enemy even moved. One of the human cadets, a young woman named Sarah, glanced over at the aliens, noticing their confusion. She didn't break her stride as she fired a plasma shot at a group of approaching enemy soldiers. She seemed to be acting on pure instinct, her body moving in sync with the chaos around her. "Don't think. Just do," Sarah muttered to herself, as though repeating the mantra that had been drilled into her since her first day as a cadet. It was something the Dithworlders did without thought. The rest of the galaxy might have been trained to fight with calculations, to plan every move carefully. But for them, that was not the way. The way of the Dithworlder was reaction, survival instinct, where every decision was made in a split second, with no room for hesitation. Across the battlefield, another human cadet, Mark, leaped into the air, using a jetpack to propel himself toward an enemy command post. He flipped and fired mid-air, taking out a squadron of enemies in seconds. It was a maneuver that the alien cadets had never seen before. They had never been taught to think so fast or act so recklessly. "How are they so precise?" one of the alien cadets asked in disbelief. "They don't think," said the instructor, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. "They just act." The alien cadets were beginning to understand the lesson, though they still struggled to keep up. This was a new kind of warfare. They had always fought with patience and foresight, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the Deathworlders didn't wait. They made the moment. The human cadets didn't stop, didn't even hesitate. They broke through the enemy's outer defenses in record time, dismantling centuries of entrenched positions as if they had done it 1,000 times before. For the first time in the simulation, the alien cadets felt a twinge of fear. They had trained their entire lives for situations like this, and yet they were being outpaced and outthought by those who hadn't even broken a sweat. "This is impossible," a Tarkian cadet said under his breath. "How can they do it?" "Because they don't see war as a problem to be solved," the instructor replied, his voice full of respect for the Deathworlders' methods. "They see it as a challenge to be conquered." The instructor gestured for the alien cadets to continue. "Don't watch them. Learn from them." But the lesson was hard to grasp. The Deathworlders fought with an intensity, a recklessness, that no one had ever taught them to emulate. The enemy forces were already breaking apart, retreating in the face of an onslaught they couldn't understand. It was like the Deathworlders were a force of nature, unpredictable and relentless. For the alien cadets, the real shock wasn't just how the Deathworlders fought. It was the feeling of being out of control. The human cadets didn't have the luxury of carefully planned strategies. Instead, they had something far more dangerous: the ability to adapt and survive in the most unpredictable ways possible. As the simulation progressed, the alien cadets began to feel the weight of their own limitations. They couldn't predict what would happen next. They could only watch, amazed, as the Deathworlders continued to rewrite the rules of warfare right before their eyes. The siege that had taken a century to build was falling apart in a matter of minutes, and the alien cadets were left scrambling, trying to catch up with the Deathworlders' furious pace. The battle wasn't just a test of strength or intelligence. It was a test of willpower. And in that, the Deathworlders were unbeatable. The turning point. The alien cadets, still reeling from their inability to keep up with the Deathworlders, were beginning to realize just how different their combat styles were. Their minds were trained to follow logic, to calculate every move, to anticipate and outmaneuver the enemy. But the Deathworlders didn't think that way. They didn't rely on strategy. They relied on something else: raw instinct. As the enemy's forces began to crumble under the human cadets' relentless onslaught, the alien cadets found themselves on the defensive for the first time. Their once impenetrable fortifications were now nothing more than obstacles being torn apart by the Deathworlders' relentless assault. With each passing minute, the alien cadets began to feel the weight of their failure. "We can't let this happen," a Rithian cadet, her green skin flushed with frustration, muttered to her comrades. "We need to regroup and rethink this. We're losing." Her words were heavy, but they seemed to echo the growing realization among the aliens. The Deathworlders were not just a force to be reckoned with. They were a force that couldn't be predicted or understood. The instructor, watching from a distance, observed the growing unease among the cadets. He could see the signs. The alien cadets were beginning to doubt themselves, their carefully honed skills now useless against the unpredictability of the humans. The instructor had seen this before in battles where the odds seemed stacked against a seasoned force. It wasn't about strength or numbers. It was about the will to adapt and overcome. "This is it," the instructor said to no one in particular, but the alien cadets heard him. "This is the moment that separates you from them." The Deathworlders, oblivious to the tension rising in the alien ranks, continued to push forward. Sarah, the young human cadet, was still in the thick of it. She was at the heart of the battle, her every move calculated in the heat of the moment, yet completely uncalculated at the same time. She slid behind cover, ducking under an explosion, only to pop out and take down 3 enemy soldiers with a single shot, all while moving with the fluidity of someone who had been born for this. It was as though the battlefield itself was an extension of her body, responding to her every instinct. To her, The fight wasn't about winning. It was about surviving, about staying one step ahead in a world that was constantly trying to kill her. "This is what we do," Sarah said under her breath, to no one in particular. "We survive." Her words, though quiet, seemed to reverberate across the battlefield. They weren't just a battle cry. They were a reminder to the alien cadets, and even to herself, that survival was the only thing that mattered in this world. It wasn't about outthinking your enemies or having the best technology. It was about making it through when everything else said you couldn't. As Sarah leaped from cover and charged toward another group of enemies, the alien cadets watched, mesmerized. They had never seen combat like this, never seen someone move with such deadly intent, with such focused determination. The idea of fear had long since disappeared for the Dithworlders. They didn't fear death. They didn't fear failure. They didn't fear anything. And that was what made them so terrifying. The alien cadets, driven by a growing sense of desperation, began to take risks. They knew they couldn't fight the Dithworlders the way they had always fought before. They had to change their approach. They had to be unpredictable, just like the humans. But it wasn't that simple. The Dithworlders had already shown that they were better at chaos, better at responding to threats with brutal efficiency. The aliens were still trying to process what was happening, still locked into their patterns of thought, while the humans were already 5 steps ahead. One alien cadet corps, a large, bulky Vraxian, charged forward, hoping to catch a group of human cadets off guard. But just as he thought he had them cornered, Sarah appeared behind him, tapping him on the shoulder. Without even turning, she fired a single shot that sent him tumbling to the ground. The Vraxian scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, but before he could react, he was surrounded by human cadets. They hadn't planned this moment. They hadn't even considered it. They simply acted. They had anticipated Kor's move before he even thought of it. "You're too slow," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady. "You have to think faster than that." The words stung, but they were true. The Vraxian, like the rest of the alien cadets, had been trained to anticipate, to strategize. But they weren't prepared for the Dithworlders' brand of warfare, where instinct and adaptability won the day. The alien cadets, now faced with the full force of the Dithworlders' unpredictable tactics, began to doubt their own abilities. They had always believed that strategy was the key to success, but in the face of pure chaos, their strategies felt irrelevant. As the simulation continued, it became clear the Dithworlders weren't just winning. They were redefining the very rules of combat. And for the alien cadets, the hardest lesson was yet to come. The battle wasn't over. But as they watched the human cadets dismantle their defenses, they began to understand what made the Dithworlders so terrifying. It wasn't just their strength. It was their ability to thrive in the most unpredictable, dangerous situations. It was their ability to adapt, to survive, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. The breaking point. The simulation was far from over, but the tide had already shifted dramatically. The alien cadets, once confident in their military training and strategy, were now scrambling to keep up with the Dithworlders. The sheer unpredictability of the humans' tactics was wearing them down, and each new encounter seemed to expose more cracks in their well-laid plans. Commander Threx, an experienced Zarkian officer, watched from the control room, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. He had been in numerous simulations before, but this one was different. The human cadets, despite their youth and lack of advanced technology, were dismantling everything the aliens had been taught. It was as though they were playing a game with no rules, and the aliens were the ones who were bound by them. "This is impossible," Threx muttered under his breath. "How can they do this?" The human cadets weren't just good, they were overwhelming in their spontaneity. Every time the aliens thought they had an advantage, a Dithworlder would appear from nowhere, exploiting the smallest weakness. They didn't plan in the traditional sense. They didn't pause to calculate their next moves. Instead, they acted on gut instinct, moving with an urgency and focus that seemed almost supernatural. In the field, Sarah continued her relentless push. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't hesitate. Her every movement was precise and calculated in its chaos. When she wasn't taking out enemies, she was distracting them, leading them into traps, or simply creating enough confusion for her fellow cadets to capitalize on. Focus on the objectives, not the fight, Sarah called out to the others, her voice cool and collected amid the madness. She wasn't just leading her team, she was shaping the battle itself. In the chaos, her calm was an anchor. Let them react to us. We don't play by their rules. The other cadets, though tired, followed her lead. They had come to trust her instincts. They didn't need elaborate plans. They just needed to stay unpredictable. Meanwhile, the alien cadets were beginning to unravel. Kor, the bulky Vraxian, had retreated after his humiliating encounter with Sarah. He was a seasoned fighter, but against the Dithworlders, it felt like his strength was meaningless. His mind, trained to anticipate and outsmart, now struggled to even keep up. Kor tried to regroup with his fellow cadets, but the fear was palpable. Their once sturdy defenses were crumbling. The Deathworlders had overwhelmed them at every turn, outpacing their strategies and neutralizing their strengths. They were facing something they had never encountered before, chaos with purpose. "I don't understand," Kor said, voice tight with frustration. "Why are they so relentless? It's as if they're not thinking at all." Kor's heart sank. It was clear now that no amount of training, no strategy or superior technology could match the Deathworlders' raw ability to survive. The human cadets had something far more valuable, a willingness to do whatever it took to win, to stay alive, no matter the cost. And that, Kor realized, was the key to their success. The simulation was nearing its end, but the damage was already done. The alien cadets had been forced to confront a truth they couldn't ignore. The Deathworlders didn't play by the rules. They didn't need to. Their survival was their strategy, and it was an unstoppable force. The question now was whether the alien cadets could accept this reality. Could they adapt in time to survive in a world where instincts ruled over strategy? In the command center, Commander Threx clenched his fists. The simulation was nearly over, and the result was undeniable. The human cadets had crushed the alien siege in less than half the time anyone thought possible. The Deathworlders had done the unthinkable. They had redefined combat in a way that no one could have anticipated. "Perhaps it's time to rethink our approach to warfare," Threx muttered under his breath, his voice filled with reluctant respect. The cadets, both alien and human, were learning something far greater than victory or defeat. They were learning that survival, true survival, was a skill that transcended any battle strategy. It was about instinct, adaptability, and an unwavering drive to overcome the odds. And as the final minutes of the simulation ticked down, it became clear. The Deathworlders had not only won, they had completely transformed the nature of the battlefield. The realization. As the dust settled and the simulation came to an end, the alien cadets stood motionless, unable to process the sheer magnitude of what had just unfolded. The Deathworlder cadets had not only outlasted them, they had crushed every plan, every strategy, and every preconceived notion they had been taught. The aliens had lost the simulation so completely that it felt almost unreal. But it wasn't over. The aliens had learned something much deeper in these few hours than they had ever expected. Commander Threx walked down from the observation deck to meet the cadets as they gathered in the training hall. His face was stern, but there was a glimmer of something else, a mix of admiration and concern. He had watched as the human cadets systematically dismantled his best-trained officers, and it was clear now that this wasn't just a victory. It was a lesson that no one in his unit had been prepared for. "Cadets," Threx began, his voice deep and commanding. "What we've just witnessed was a first. Never have we encountered a force like this." The cadets didn't need to be told that. They had already realized it for themselves. For most, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had been defeated by what seemed like pure chaos, a level of unpredictability that made their meticulously planned maneuvers appear obsolete. It wasn't about strength or numbers. It was about the Deep-Worlders' ability to adapt, to endure, and to exploit every opening, no matter how small. One by one, the alien cadets began to ask the questions that had been gnawing at them throughout the simulation. Kor, the towering Vraxian, spoke first. His voice was a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Commander, how did they know what we would do? It's like they didn't even care about the objectives. They just kept pushing forward, no matter what." Commander Threx nodded, understanding Kor's confusion. He, too, had been struggling with the same question. The Deep-Worlders' actions seemed illogical, but they were ruthlessly effective. It was as if they didn't follow the usual rules of combat at all. "They don't think like us," Threx said, his tone softening just slightly. "They don't approach war the way we do. They fight to survive, not to win. There's a big difference." Sarah, who had overheard the conversation, stepped forward. She looked at the gathered alien cadets with a calm, almost pitying gaze. "You're not wrong," she said quietly, her words cutting through the tension. "We don't care about victory or defeat. We care about survival." She gestured to her fellow human cadets. "You see, on a death world, you don't get the luxury of thinking about tactics or strategies. You just fight. And when you fight, you adapt to the situation, no matter how dire it seems. The environment will kill you if you don't." One of the alien cadets, a young Lynthian, spoke up. "But why didn't you just follow the plan? Why didn't you just play by the rules?" His voice held an edge of accusation. It was clear he didn't understand. Sarah smiled, a slight curve of her lips that held no humor. "Because there are no rules when you're trying to survive. You think we don't have plans. We do, but the first thing we learn is to throw them out the window when things go wrong." The cadets were silent, digesting her words. The concept was alien to them, literally. Every military strategy they had been taught relied on careful execution and a structured approach. But the Deathworlders didn't play by any of those rules. They operated with a freedom that was impossible to predict. And that, it seemed, was what made them unstoppable. Kor's voice broke the silence. "I've fought in real battles before. I've seen chaos, but I'd never seen anything like that. They don't care about winning. They only care about surviving." Threx gave Kor a long look. The same realization had dawned on him. The human cadets didn't care about the simulation, about victory. They cared about one thing: survival. And in doing so, they had shown the alien cadets just how far a person could go when they weren't bound by rules or expectations. "You're right," Threx admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "This was not a battle about winning. It was about surviving. And the Deathworlders have mastered that." The reality of that statement hit hard. The alien cadets have been trained to face all sorts of threats, but nothing had prepared them for a mindset so focused on survival above all else. They were soldiers, but the Deathworlders were survivors. And that was a force that couldn't be easily matched. Sarah took a step back, her eyes scanning the group. "This is something you can't teach in a classroom," she said. "It's something you have to learn when your life is on the line. If you don't adapt, you die. It's that simple." Kor stared at her, his mind racing as he processed what she had said. "So you're saying that no matter what we do, no matter how many simulations we run, we won't ever be able to match that?" Sarah's gaze softened, but her response was firm. "Not unless you change the way you think. You'll need to forget everything you've been taught and start from scratch. Survival doesn't have a playbook. It just happens." The room was filled with stunned silence. The alien cadets were still processing the magnitude of their loss, but they knew one thing for certain. They had just witnessed the true power of a Deathworlder's mind. It wasn't just their strength or their tactics that made them dangerous. It was their ability to think and survive without limits. The aliens had learned a harsh but valuable lesson that day. Sometimes, The greatest threat is not the strength of your enemy, but the ferocity with which they fight to stay alive. The aftermath. The training hall buzzed with tension as the alien cadets sat in stunned silence. The hum of their low conversations filled the room, but there was an undeniable sense of discomfort. They had been bested, no, shattered, by the Deathworlder cadets. The human trainees had thrown every rule, every strategy, and every expectation out the window. The aliens had thought they were facing a traditional military exercise, but what they had encountered was something far beyond their understanding. Commander Threx stood at the front of the room, his stern face still locked in that contemplative expression. His hands were clasped behind his back as he addressed the cadets, each of them now reflecting on the lesson they had learned. They had all trained for years under the assumption that skill, preparation, and knowledge were the only factors that determined success. But now, they understood that adaptability, raw, unfiltered adaptability, could trump everything they had known. It is not enough to fight with knowledge and training. Threx began, his voice deep and steady. The Deathworlders have shown us that. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. They do not fight to follow orders. They fight to survive. There is a world of difference between the two. Kor, the towering Vraxian, had been silent since the simulation ended. But now his voice broke through the quiet murmurs. So, how do we change? How do we fight like them? Threx's gaze softened. That is the challenge, Kor. We have to rethink everything. We've trained to follow protocols, to use our strengths in calculated ways. But the Deathworlders have taught us that survival comes first. The rest is secondary. The alien cadets looked at each other, unsure of what to make of the commander's words. Could they really change the way they fought, the way they thought? Was it possible to shift from a mindset focused on precision to one that embraced unpredictability? We need to strip away everything we've learned. Threx continued, pacing slowly before the group. We need to embrace chaos, to think on our feet and react to our environment, not just to each other. The Deathworlders, they are the embodiment of chaos, and they've shown us that, sometimes, the most dangerous thing is a creature who doesn't play by the rules. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Kor was still lost in thought. He could barely fathom the idea of abandoning everything he had been taught. His entire life had been built on precision, tactics, and order. The concept of chaos seemed foreign and unsettling. But then, a voice cut through the silence. It was Sarah, the Deathworlder cadet who had, in many ways, led them to this realization. It's not chaos that makes us strong, she said calmly. It's our ability to adapt, to improvise. We don't rely on a plan. We rely on the situation in front of us. We thrive in moments where others panic. Her words seemed to settle in the air, hanging there for a long moment. Adaptability, Threx repeated, almost as if he had just discovered a hidden truth. You're right. It's adaptability. The alien cadets were beginning to grasp it, slowly but surely. They had always been taught to control every aspect of the battlefield, but the Deathworlders were teaching them something far more fundamental. Control was an illusion. True strength lay in surviving whatever chaos the battlefield could throw at you. Kor, whose giant frame was still slightly hunched with the weight of defeat, looked up at Sarah. But how do we survive without structure, without guidance? Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. You trust yourself. You trust your instincts. The battlefield will always be unpredictable. If you wait for things to settle, you'll miss your chance. You have to learn to act before it's too late. The room fell silent once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the stunned quiet of disbelief. It was the quiet of realization. The aliens were starting to see the truth behind Sarah's words. They were being asked to unlearn everything they had spent years mastering. The silence was eventually broken by a soft voice from the back of the room. It was Jax, a young gyro cadet who had watched the simulation unfold in awe. You're saying that the best strategy is no strategy at all. Sarah smiled slightly. Exactly. That was the breakthrough moment. The cadets were starting to understand. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about surviving, adapting, and being willing to do whatever it took to keep going. The rules they had been taught no longer mattered. What mattered was that they could learn, adjust, and evolve. Commander Threx turned back to the group. You've all seen what happens when we try to fight using old methods. Now it's time for us to evolve. The Deathworlders have shown us that. We need to become like them, because in war, survival is the only victory that matters. The cadets nodded slowly, their minds already churning with new possibilities. They were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors. As they left the training hall that day, each cadet walked away with a new understanding of what it meant to fight. The lesson had been painful, but necessary. The Deathworlders had not just defeated them in a simulation, they had opened their eyes to a new way of thinking. And now, it was up to the aliens to embrace that lesson, to throw away the rules, and to learn the true meaning of survival. The future of this training, and their own survival in future battles, would depend on it. And the Deathworlders had just shown them how to live in a world where nothing was certain, and where everything could change in an instant. A new beginning. The days following the simulation were full of quiet reflection. The alien cadets had come to understand something that had never fully clicked before. Their training, while impressive, had made them predictable. They had learned to rely on strategy and structure, but the Deathworlders had proved that unpredictability could be their greatest asset. Now, the real test began. How would they adapt to a world where nothing could be predicted? The commander, Threx, had instructed them to focus on the essence of adaptability. No more focusing on set strategies, no more rigid planning. Each cadet now had to challenge their own instinctual responses and consider what they would do in the heat of chaos. It was not about being faster or stronger. It was about being smarter, more flexible, and more capable of thinking in the moment. Sarah, the Deathworlder cadet, had become their unofficial mentor. She was always nearby, offering insights and suggestions, but she never gave them the answers. Instead, she pushed them to figure things out on their own. She had a unique way of watching the cadets train, standing silently at the back of the room, letting them struggle through their own mistakes, then waiting until they were ready to accept her help. But that week, something strange happened. As the cadets practiced in the training halls, they were no longer focused on trying to outdo each other using traditional techniques. Instead, they began to experiment. They deliberately created chaos in their simulations, broken systems, lost equipment, distractions. It wasn't the way they had been taught, but it felt right. It was a test of their minds, not their bodies. Kor, the towering Vraxian, led the charge. His massive frame made him the least likely candidate to thrive in chaos, but it was precisely his hesitation to rely on strength that began to change everything. At first, he tried to use sheer force to solve problems, but that only made things worse. He was too big, too strong, and everything fell apart when he was in the middle of it. But the more he failed, the more he understood. Sarah watched, standing in the corner of the training hall, as Kor's methodical style began to shift. The next time a simulation started, he didn't rely on brute strength. Instead, he observed the surroundings, looking for cracks in the simulation, areas where things might go wrong. And then, instead of fighting through it, he adapted. He used his size to maneuver through unexpected changes, guiding his squad without brute force. Slowly, the cadets began to notice. Kor, the giant, wasn't dominating. He was thinking. See, Sarah's voice cut through the air. That's how you do it. No one expects you to be perfect. Just learn to handle what comes next. The cadets were starting to get it. This wasn't just about mimicking the Deathworlders. It was about breaking away from everything they thought they knew. It was about being open to failure, to uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, they found strength. As the days passed, the training became more intense. The aliens, once rigid in their approach to conflict, were now in uncharted territory. They no longer had perfect control over the simulations, but they had something far more valuable: resilience. The day of the final test came quickly. The commander had set up a simulation unlike any they had ever faced. This was not a scenario of simply defeating an enemy. It was a complete breakdown of the system. The simulation would throw everything at them: broken weapons, unexpected attacks, disarray in the ranks. The aliens had to adapt, think on their feet, and survive in a world that wouldn't slow down for them. Sarah stood back, arms crossed, watching her fellow Deathworlders as they observed the alien cadets in action. The human cadets knew what it meant to adapt, but now it was the aliens' turn to prove they had learned the lesson. As the simulation began, chaos immediately erupted. The aliens were thrown into disarray. Their plans, their strategies, everything they had trained for, were suddenly meaningless. This time, they couldn't rely on the old rules. The alien cadets panicked briefly, but then something remarkable happened. They adapted. Kor found himself in the middle of the battlefield, his massive frame dodging blasts and swinging with precision at opponents, but he wasn't fighting like before. He was thinking, reacting, and adjusting. The aliens who had once only followed orders now began making split-second decisions that led to success in the most chaotic of situations. The rules didn't matter anymore. They were just soldiers fighting to survive. The simulation ended, and the hall fell silent once again. The alien cadets were covered in sweat, their breaths heavy from the intensity of the exercise, but they had succeeded. They had fought without plans, without strategies, and without their once perfect order. They had adapted. They had survived. Commander Threx stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but there was a spark in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Well done," he said simply. "You've learned what we've all needed to learn." The cadets stood in shock, still processing what had just happened. But as they looked around at each other, they understood. They had been pushed beyond their limits, and they had risen to the challenge. It was no longer about the enemy they faced. It was about how they had changed themselves. And in that moment, as they stood in the aftermath of the final test, the alien cadets realized that they were no longer the same. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were survivors, ready for whatever chaos the universe could throw at them. The Deathworlders had not only shown them how to survive, they had shown them how to live.